Hello, everyone, and welcome to Discovery's Chats with Changemakers. I'm your student host, Kavya, and I'm 11th grader from New Jersey. And I'm also a member of SWE-NEXT, which is the Society of Women Engineers Leadership Program for high school girls. And every month on the show, I chat with a different guest from the STEM community about their career and work. Neil Armstrong once said, "Every human has a finite number of heartbeats. I don't intend to waste any of mine." Today, my heartbeat is skipping with excitement because it's Introduce a Girl to Engineering Day. And I'm super excited to be celebrating with this special episode as part of Discovery's Engineering Week activities. Today, I am chatting with Cathy Koerner, a NASA engineer who is guiding the development of Artemis missions that will land the first woman on the moon and send humans to Mars. Cathy, welcome. We are so excited for you to join us today.
Thank you, Kavya. I'm very excited to be here with all of you today.
I'm going to be asking Cathy a few questions to get to know a little bit more about her. And you can also type your questions in the Q&A box below, and we'll save some time to get to as many as we can. Also, be sure to stay tuned until the end of today's session, where we will introduce a hands-on engineering challenge that you can try at home. So without further ado, let's get started. So Cathy, can you tell us about your career path? How did you get started at NASA and what is your current role?
You bet. So let's see. I want to start out by saying when I was in high school, I really had no idea of what I wanted to do with my life. And so I chose a major for college that I had somewhat of an interest in, but wasn't entirely sure about. And sure enough, about 2, maybe 3 years into my college career, I decided to change. And I really, even then, didn't know what I wanted to do. I had a tremendous friend who asked me to sit in on a class with him to see if I might like what he was interested in. And sure enough, I was, and that was aerospace engineering. So that's what kind of started me down the path of being an aerospace engineer. My first job out of college, out of graduate school, was at the NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. Most people know JPL through the Curiosity rover on Mars. So those are the kinds of missions that I worked on. And then from there, actually, my career path took me to the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, where I worked in mission operations. I was a flight controller for a space shuttle program, worked actually in mission control. And then I had the privilege of becoming a shuttle flight director and eventually a space station flight director, where I got to actually be in charge of mission control during some very exciting assembly missions for the International Space Station. After I worked in operations, I spent some time actually working in the International Space Station program, where I helped build the International Space Station from the programmatic side. And then my career actually took a little bit of a detour, and I spent 5 years running a health and medical organization at the Johnson Space Center. So I was literally a rocket scientist running a health and medical organization responsible for astronaut health. From there, I became the Orion program manager. Orion is the spacecraft that's going to take our humans to the moon and beyond. And then from there, I had the privilege of coming to NASA headquarters, which is where I am now. I work at NASA headquarters, and I'm in the Exploration Systems Development Mission Directorate, which is a fancy way of saying I help create and develop the missions that are going to go to the moon and eventually to Mars.
Wow, that's so interesting to hear because your path is really nonlinear and you kept redesigning your path within NASA. So that's awesome. And so while serving as manager of the International Space Station Vehicle Office, what types of responsibilities did you manage?
Yeah, so when I was in the space station vehicle office, that's the office responsible for all of the spacecraft that is the International Space Station. So for those of you who aren't aware, the International Space Station is an orbiting laboratory. It's been in orbit for more than 20 years. So if you are younger than 20 years of age, then you have never lived a day of your life where there have not been astronauts living and working in space. So it's been manned continuously for more than 20 years. We do research on the International Space Station, and my part of, and the role I had in that was actually building the hardware that became the International Space Station. So when I came into the International Space Station Program Vehicle Office, we were in the middle of assembly, and it took many space shuttle missions to assemble all the piece parts that is the current International Space Station, and I helped to manage that assembly process.
So it seems like a lot of collaborating and innovating. And I'm a little curious about the tools that you used in that process. So, what is one piece of technology that is a must-have in all of your projects?
So I'm going to answer the question two different ways, actually, because you talked about collaborating, and actually Zoom calls like this and Teams calls, and that kind of is very important when you have a big collaborative type of a project. I currently work at NASA headquarters, but I actually live in Houston, Texas. And so I have an office at the Johnson Space Center. I'm currently, if you see the banner behind me, I'm currently actually at the Marshall Space Flight Center. So having technologies that enable you to be collaborative across multiple platforms and in multiple locations, especially when we have international partners involved, is huge. And that's a very key technology. But I will tell you, when I go to mission control and I talk to people about what we do in mission control, I will tell you the most important piece of equipment in mission control is the coffee pot. It has to be working because it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And coffee keeps us all moving when we need to at times.
Definitely. I'm a coffee lover as well, so I can agree with that. And I think you really emphasize connection, which is an important part of engineering that's often overlooked because you're always collaborating. So thank you for sharing that. And from your experience in developing human spacecraft, what is one surprising piece of knowledge that you think most people may not know of?
Yeah, so the time that I spent running this health and medical organization that I mentioned earlier taught me a lot about what happens to the human body in microgravity. And that's something I think people don't realize is your whole human physiology changes and adapts when you go into space. Most astronauts, when they get on orbit, experience what's called space adaptation sickness, which is an illness that prevents them from their bodies from functioning correctly until they can adapt. Many of them adapt right away, and some of them take a lot longer. But there's some things that we've noticed, especially when we've had some very long duration International Space Station flights, where the astronauts' bodies have actually reconfigured. Their bone structure reconfigures. The shape of their eye changes. If you've ever watched some of the videos of astronauts playing around with like bubbles of water floating, right? Your eye is mostly like a little bubble of water. And so how you've seen those bubbles change, your eye actually changes its shape while you're in microgravity. And that affects your eyesight. So people who have glasses, their prescription might change while they're in orbit, that kind of thing. And I think people don't realize how much of your body actually changes and adapts to the environment. The same is true though when you come back home from space. You have to readapt when you get back on the ground. So it usually takes astronauts about 30 days from the time that they come back to when they've completely mitigated all the side effects of being in space, which if you think about it, 30 days, on the ground where you can't necessarily drive or can't turn corners without falling over because your vestibular system is all askew, or because your muscle strength has deteriorated because your legs and your back aren't used to working in a gravity environment. Those are the kinds of things that people I don't think would necessarily realize.
That's fascinating. And I had a quick follow-up question. So is there any like preparation that they have to do before they're going into these microgravity environments, any training for their bodies?
Absolutely. They do. They do fitness training. And we also are trying to figure out how, and there's lots of studies and experiments going on now to figure out how to adjust and calibrate their vestibular system. So that's what helps you stay balanced, right? So when you lean over, you can kind of feel it. It's the same kind of thing like if you've ever gotten motion sickness, whether on an airplane or a roller coaster ride. We're trying to train that sensation so that the crews recognize it and their bodies can adapt to it more quickly.
Awesome. And I know that your job requires a lot of innovation. So in what ways do you think your role encourages you to be a change maker?
I'll tell you, one of the things that I think marks a great engineer and anybody who's even thinking about becoming an engineer is their curiosity. Like if you're curious about why something is and how something could be different and why is it that way and not this way, that makes you a good engineer and it helps you be innovative. The more you can ask questions and be curious about why something is the way it is and how it could be different, drives innovation. To me, innovation is all about change, and it's about recognizing that where you are today isn't necessarily where you need to be in the future. And so charting a course and trying to figure out how to go to that new destination is all about innovation.
Awesome. And we have our first audience question from Andover Elementary School in Orlando, Florida. And their question is, what is your favorite words of advice to young girls interested in engineering?
Don't accept no for an answer. Straight up, I will tell you a story, which will probably date me a little bit. But my very first branch chief, when I came to work at NASA, when I had my very first meeting with him, he told me that it was a shame that I was an engineer because women like me used to make great secretaries. And I thought, huh, well, actually, I think women like me would make great engineers too, right? And it was because of that sort of, hey, I don't think you're good enough to do this, that motivated me to work harder and to prove them wrong, so to speak, and to not accept no. Every time I would come up with no, I'd say, okay, well, how can I turn that no into a yes? How can I change this maybe setback into an opportunity that I can capitalize on in the future?
Thank you for sharing that. It's a perfect message for Introduce a Girl to Engineering Day. And you mentioned turning an obstacle into an opportunity, and that's an important leadership skill, which leads me to my next
Indeed.
question. Yeah. So as a leader, you have to constantly manage the interests of different stakeholders. How are you able to achieve that?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer it the same way I answer the question when someone asks me how do you manage work-life balance? And there's no such thing as balance. There's no balancing in work life, and there's no balancing in your stakeholders either. I refer to it as juggling, right? You have to juggle your stakeholders. And by that, I mean, they're constantly in motion. What they need is constantly changing. So how you adapt to that has to constantly change. And sometimes when you're juggling, it's okay to let a ball bounce and then pick it up later. So it's okay to maybe not pay as much attention to one stakeholder as it is to another stakeholder that's a little bit more key at a given time and more important. So it's a constant juggling. It's recognizing that those priorities shift back and forth as you're juggling the priorities and the stakeholders' needs and interests.
That's actually interesting because I expected that it would be balancing, but now you talked about prioritization, and I think that definitely makes a lot more sense. And
And the prioritization, if I could add, the prioritization changes over time. Like
mhm,
if you set your priorities, they don't have to always be in that order. Sometimes they move depending on circumstances and the time duration.
yeah, so constantly reevaluating the situation.
Exactly.
Awesome. And so now I want to take a little bit of a blast to the past and talk about how you first got started in the world of engineering. What drew you to the field of aeronautics?
Yeah, so I've always had a love of space and space exploration from an early age. And part of that is because I grew up watching the Apollo astronauts.
Yeah.
And so I'm really excited that we're just now starting into the Artemis generation. We just the end of last year had our very first Artemis 1 mission. It was an uncrewed test mission, but it was very exciting. And it's my hope that as we do more of these Artemis missions and we start flying crew and we go back to the moon and land the first woman and the first person of color on the surface of the moon, that generates that same kind of excitement that will encourage people of all colors and shapes and sizes and genders to actually pursue engineering to help us solve the difficult technical challenges that are going to be needed to not just go to the moon, but to go on to Mars.
And when you were in middle school, did you know what you wanted to be when you grew up?
No, like I said earlier, I did not only did I not know when I was in middle school, I didn't know when I was in high school. And I even struggled with it partway through college before I finally kind of found my niche and the thing that married my interests and my skills. That's the challenge, right? Your passions and your interests and your skills need to all align for you to really be successful.
Definitely connecting your passion with the purpose. I think that's really important. And we have another audience question from Casey. So, how do astronauts accommodate for eyesight changes while they're in space? And you mentioned that the glasses prescriptions might change, but what do they do about that while they're on board the
It's a
international?
great Yeah, it's a great question. We actually fly multiple prescriptions.
Mhm.
So they'll have their original that they have on the ground, but then we have other prescription glasses on orbit that will help them because sometimes we can predict which direction their eyesight will change. It doesn't change dramatically, and it's not something that happens instantaneous. It actually evolves over time. So we fly multiple glasses for them so they can just change out glasses when they need to.
That's pretty cool. And I know you touched on this a little earlier, but what is one skill that an engineer of the future should develop?
Yeah, so what I will tell you is math is really the language of engineering. So
Mhm.
if you can develop skills in math and understanding mathematical principles, that will help you go a long way in engineering. Math always came relatively easy to me. It was something that I understood way better than I understood maybe some other things that are associated with engineering. But math becomes that universal language across all science as well as engineering skills.
All right. And finally, so what would you tell kids who aren't so sure about engineering or who may feel that they're not cut out to be an engineer?
I will tell you that we need all types of folks to support us in the international or in space exploration in general. We have need for artists to do graphic design. We have need for engineers, scientists, medical doctors. I mentioned, I ran an organization responsible for astronaut health. That requires a certain medical skill set that doesn't exist in typical terrestrial medicine. But we do need medical doctors. We need biomedical engineers, the people that know how the human system works and how to keep it functioning well. We need all kinds in order to move forward in exploration, from people who can weld machinery to help build our spacecraft to people who understand fluid systems and understand how fluid moves through pipes, right? So all of those kinds of skills can still apply towards exploration. So if you really like what we do at NASA, human exploration in particular, and you have a skill that isn't necessarily engineering, but could be applied to what we do at NASA, then you could fit right in.
Space is for everyone, like you said.
Yep.
So that's great. And I know you mentioned like the diversity of skill sets, which I think is not really known that much because we only think of engineering as the only thing in NASA, but there's other fields that are also in there as well.
In
So,
fact, in this room with me are folks who don't have any engineering background but do communications, right?
oh,
Public relations kinds of activities, and they help set up these kinds of interactions for us. So we have, again, all skill sets required.
great. And we have another audience question from Danielson Middle School in Leander, Texas, where you're from. So, when are we planning to put people back on the moon?
Yeah, so the Artemis 3 is the mission where we're going to land humans on the moon currently, right? Artemis 1 was an uncrewed test flight. Artemis 2 will be a crewed test flight where we're going to take astronauts and go around the moon and then bring them back. Still testing out the Orion spacecraft and the Space Launch System, which you see a model of behind me. And then Artemis 3. And right now, Artemis 3 is planned for 2025. So fingers crossed that all works well and all of our testing goes well, and then we'll be launching our astronauts back to the moon in 2025.
Definitely, that would be amazing to be able to watch. And Tiffany also wants to know what is the best part of being an engineer?
I think the best part of being an engineer is really the best part of any job, at least in my personal opinion, is the people that I work with. I work with some phenomenal people who love what they do. They have a passion for what we're doing. They're excited to come to work every day. And, even on the days where there's drudgery because you're in meetings and there's all budget things that we have to worry about, right? It's a lot of fun because what we're doing is really amazing.
Definitely. And I'm noticing a common theme is collaboration. So I'm sure that you've been able to meet a lot of people and work with so many different skill sets. So that's really interesting to hear. And now we're gonna get into some more like fun questions. And to start off, if you could have any superpower, what would it be and why?
Oh goodness. So, everybody usually picks a superpower like telekinesis or, teletransport. My superpower is probably going to sound odd, but I would love to have the superpower that I could eat anything I want and still be healthy. So I could eat as much Tex-Mex or as much chocolate or as much ice cream as I absolutely wanted and still be healthy. And yeah, but I know that's not reality, and so I have to take care of my body. So I put good things in so I can can feel good and can perform well.
I think the astronauts would also agree because this way they don't have to worry too much in the microgravity environment.
Yep.
And we have another audience question from Teresa who would like to know, like, what's your day-to-day routine or life at work?
Right now, my routine at work is a lot of meetings. So actually doing this discussion with you is kind of fun because it's a break from the meeting that I was in this morning and, what I'm going to go back to when we're done here. But, what I do now is really help enable other people to do their jobs. So with having a job now at NASA headquarters, I don't get to do any of the fun things like work on missions and assemble spacecraft anymore. I have folks that do that, but I'm in meetings a lot to help advocate for them and the work that they're performing and help them solve the technical problems that they're really the ones doing the work on.
And my next question is like, what's something that you've done in your life that you're really proud of?
Oh goodness, probably what I'm most proud of is raising two amazing kids. I have two kids, a boy and a girl, who are in college, and they're happy and healthy, and they're pursuing what they love. And so, to me, that's probably the most proudest thing I've done.
It's very sweet to hear. And finally, what is a skill that you haven't quite mastered yet, but you would like to?
If I could go back in time to when I was younger, I would learn to play the piano. I love the idea of playing the piano, and I don't know how to do it, and I would love to learn to do that.
Definitely. And so we have some other questions as well, kind of related to all three of these areas. So, as the former manager of the Orion program, which developed spacecraft that will be carrying humans to the moon and back, can you share like why this project is important to you?
Yeah, so Orion spacecraft is the spacecraft that we have built that is going to take our astronauts into deep space. And I'm really excited about that because it's the first time since Apollo that we have built a spacecraft of this kind. And we're doing it much more safely than we ever did during the Apollo era. We didn't really know what we didn't know back then. And we took a lot of the lessons that we learned from Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, and from Space Shuttle, and we use that to help us build the Orion spacecraft. It's state of the art. If you saw any of the video from the Artemis 1 mission, you saw we flew a Moonican. Not a mannequin, but a Moonican named Arturos Campos, who is named after one of the engineers who helped save the Apollo 13 mission. You saw the inside of that spacecraft. All of that is new and different. All the technology that is in there is touchscreen kind of technology in addition to switches and panels. So a lot of what we've done is take advantage of the knowledge that we have from the past missions and brought in future technologies to help us design that spacecraft. And it really is going to be the workhorse for NASA for taking our astronauts into deep space. So I'm excited about that.
And I think it's I think you mentioned that how your past experience really helped you. And I think that's an important part of engineering because whether it's like a success or failure, you can still learn something from whatever you're working on. So it's great.
Absolutely. In fact, I tell people one of my favorite quotes, I think it's from John Maxwell, is fail early, fail often, but fail forward. Right. So if you're going to fail, right, it's okay to try and fail, but how you react to that failure is really what defines you. It's not the failure itself.
Yeah, you want to fall like seed so you can kind of grow back, even though.
Exactly.
Awesome. And so when you're developing this spacecraft, I'm sure there are tons of factors that you have to take into consideration. So could you please talk about some of that, specifically when it comes to ensuring the comfort and safety of engineers? Or sorry, passengers who are going in.
Yeah. So it's interesting because it's a little different for a spacecraft than it is for like the comfort and safety of your car or, where a transportation system on the ground, because you can work in all the dimensions, right? You can work in three dimensions when you're in microgravity. Because the astronauts float, you have to worry about like what's above their head. But not only do you have to worry about that, you can actually use that space. So it's a different way of engineering and architecting the space that you have available to you within the spacecraft, because you can use the entirety of the environment. The other challenge is, though, in a microgravity environment, everything floats. So you have to be really cognizant of how you put things. I can't just set a pen down someplace and assume it's going to stay there, because it's not. It's going to go somewhere else. And that's true of everything, whether it's the water that you're drinking or the utensils that you're using while eating. So you have to be really conscious and aware of that, so that the astronauts themselves are protected from their environment. So we do a lot of human factor studies to see how we can better adapt the spacecraft to fit how the human works in that environment. We do a lot of things to make sure that when they're strapped into their suits, that they have the ability to reach forward and touch the panels, that those are close enough to them, that the things that are essential are within reach. So there's a lot of those kind of what we call human in the loop testing that we do on our spacecraft before we ever finalize the design.
And in those studies where you're like looking at those factors that affect humans, I was wondering, do you use any type of simulation technology or models to?
We do both. We do actual testing with simulations, like we build up a mock-up of whatever the spacecraft is or the thing is that we're trying to test, and we actually test it in real life. And a lot of times we also do computer-aided modeling. So we have folks that are specialized in VR goggles and how those can map the inside of our spacecraft, so we can virtually simulate what the interior of our spacecraft will look like before we ever start cutting metal and assembling it and putting it together.
Great. And I do want to talk a little bit about role models because we had an audience question, which was actually, who are some people who have inspired you? I think it's a great question.
Oh, goodness. Let's see. There's so many. So I will tell you, Madame Curie comes to mind, right? She's the first female to win a Nobel Prize. I believe it was in physics. And then she later became the first person to ever receive 2 Nobel Prizes. One in the first one was in physics. The second one, I think, was in chemistry, if I'm remembering correctly. She was just a groundbreaker, right? Being the first woman, she was a groundbreaker in just the radiation studies and experiments that she did. It really advanced technology a long ways in what she did in a very short amount of time. But other people have inspired me as well. Sandra Day O'Connor inspired me, right? She, again, was the first woman to sit on the Supreme Court. So usually women in particular who have fought against the odds to do something new and different and to break that glass ceiling, so to speak, have been role models to me. I wasn't necessarily one of those, right? I have been the first in a few instances, but there have usually been women a few who have gone before me and done some things, and I've been fortunate enough to follow in their footsteps.
That's wonderful to hear. And are there currently many female engineers in NASA?
There are a whole lot more than when I started. I can tell you that. There are a whole lot more than when I started.
And hopefully that will grow after this conversation. We'll see more.
I'm hoping to inspire some of you on this call.
I think it's definitely working for sure. We have another audience question from Sebastian at Jerry Knight STEM Academy in Mansfield, Texas. What year do you think we will be able to start a colony on Mars or the moon?
Wow, a colony. It's harder to do a colony because that requires a whole lot of infrastructure. And by that I mean you have to have power for an entire colony and communications, right? And you think about how easy it is to find a plug to power into something here on the ground. Not quite as easy to do that on the surface of the moon or on Mars. You know, we're really, with Artemis program, we're really looking to establish a continuous human presence on the lunar surface. We have to start by sending astronauts, setting up that infrastructure and establishing that. So I honestly couldn't guess on a date for when we might do that. It's my hope that that we have a regular cadence, an annual cadence of lunar missions with Artemis here in the very near future. And then beyond that, that we start having that very first mission to Mars. That's even going to be an even bigger challenge because it's a lot bigger distance, right? It's like being a year more away from Earth in the event of an emergency, as opposed to just being a few days away from Earth where we are on the moon in the event of an emergency. So it's a bigger challenge to go to Mars. So I'm not sure a colony is anytime soon, but maybe it'll be in your lifetime when you're an engineer and you're sitting in a seat like this being interviewed. Maybe by then it'll have happened.
And, on all of these projects, what other types of engineers do you work with?
Yeah, so I'm an aerospace engineer. We have mechanical engineers, electrical engineers. I think I mentioned earlier, biomedical engineers. We have all kinds of engineers that contribute. But we also, as I mentioned earlier, we have more than engineers, right? We have people that study math and physics and computer science, and we have people that do arts and, they're more artistic and they do graphic design for us, or people who are good at communications and they do communications for us. That's the kind of thing that that made me say earlier, right? Space is for all. We've got work to do that crosses all kinds of industries and all kinds of fields.
That gives a lot of promise for all of us because we all can play a role in that. So nice to hear. And we have another audience question from Ben, and this is about the Artemis mission preparation. So, how long did it take to plan that mission?
So mission planning typically takes, well, it depends on the type of mission, but typically mission planning is a couple, 2 to 3 year cycle. When you have a regular cadence. Now, the first Artemis mission, because it was the first, took a lot longer than that, right? Because we have to figure out how we're going to execute the mission, what it's going to look like, how the rocket's going to function, how the spacecraft's going to function. So usually the preparation takes a lot longer, but when we're actually doing, I'll say, a regular cadence of missions, I'd say 2 to 3 years to plan the mission, because first you have to figure out what you're going to do, but then eventually, as you get closer and closer, you narrow that down and you end up putting together a timeline for the astronauts that is in about 15-minute increments. So imagine having, say it ends up being a 30-day mission. Imagine having a 30-day mission completely planned out in 15-minute increments. I bet if I asked you today what you're going to be doing for the next 30 days, you probably couldn't outline it in 15-minute increments. But that's the kind of detail that we put in planning that we put into our missions.
That's really interesting because you're breaking it down to such a small scale. So I can't even imagine how much detail and decision making goes into that. And we have another audience question for Michelle, and she wants to know how the astronauts eat food on the moon or Mars.
The same way they eat it on Earth. Other than you got to be careful, right, about how you eat, because crumbs that float away instead of falling down. If you think about it, a crumb floating away could end up being something you inhale. So we have to be really particular about the food that we give the astronauts to eat. They can't have a lot of crumbs on them. Usually there's a higher moisture content in the food, and the food is actually engineered specifically for the microgravity environment. That way you don't have to worry about things like crumbs. If you broke open a saltine cracker, all the salt would float away. And if you got salt in your eye, think about what that's like if you've ever had salt in your eye before. It hurts, right? So you got to be careful about the types of foods. But in general, eating, right, is just like eating terrestrially. Instead of having an open-ended cup, you have a straw that you sip out of so that the fluid doesn't float away. You have more moisture content so it sticks together when you eat and it doesn't go floating away. But again, like I said, your body tends to adapt really well, so it knows and it recognizes the food and it gobbles it just fine.
And we had another question from Tyler, and it was, how do you ensure that all of these missions and equipment go smoothly?
Yeah, a lot of planning, and a lot of what we refer to as next worst failure. So we think about what's the next worst thing that can happen, and we plan for that, and we put contingencies in place for that next worst failure. And if you do that, that helps you be successful in the long run. So the reason that they're so successful, even though they're highly complex, is because we have a lot of really smart people who think about what is the next worst thing that can happen, and we plan for that.
So a lot of imagination and creativity has to go because you have to plan for almost any scenario. That's
right. You plan not only for what you're going to do, but for what might go wrong in what you're going to do.
great. And you've worked on so many amazing projects, so much success, but I'm particularly curious, what has been the most challenging mission or project that you've ever worked on?
Oh goodness, there's so many things that come to mind when you say it. I'll share a story, and it's really not necessarily about a project, but it's about a job that I had to do. So one of the transitions and the jobs that I did is I went to work for somebody because their deputy was terminally ill. And so I was asked to step in and help do that job while that person was on medical leave. And that was really, really hard. It was really hard to do, to come in and not appear like I was taking advantage of the situation, but actually help that person and that organization do the job that needed to be done. And that was probably the most difficult job I've ever had, just because it was hard to do somebody else's job when they were facing such difficult circumstances. But in the long run, it ended up helping that individual that I was able to step in and help, and then it helped the organization. So I felt good about it because it was contributing, even though, like I said, it was under really sad circumstances.
And it's wonderful to hear how you were able to quickly adapt. And I'm sure that must have been a really valuable learning experience.
It was very a learning experience for me personally, I'd say, more than anything else. Yeah.
So I had another question. I'm sure your role that you have to constantly learn and keep up with the latest trends in technology. How are you able to do that?
Yeah, I have really smart people that work with me and they keep track of that. Actually, no, at NASA, we have a space technology mission directorate that is really responsible, or yeah, space technology mission directorate that is responsible for identifying some of those technologies and actually creating some of those future technologies that we can bring into what we're doing. And we do an annual review of our architecture, our exploration architecture, that in that review process, we actually look at what new technologies are out there that we can take advantage of and incorporate that into our planning going forward.
Seems like every person that you're working with is like this link in this important chain, and you need everyone to get those missions carried out successfully. I think that's something that we're all learning so far.
Exploration is definitely a team sport.
Yeah. And we had another question about what's it like when you're working in mission control? And this question is from Andrew at Jerry Knight STEM Academy.
Thanks for the question, Andrew. It's very exciting, but it's also very humbling, right? When you realize how many amazing people have worked in that facility and done some amazing things. It's very humbling to do that, but it's also very exciting because you are at the hub of space operations when you're working in mission control. If you've seen the movie Apollo 13, right? I was not I had that role with a guy who had the crew cut and the vest, right? That's the role that I had in mission control. I never had a crew cut though, by the way, but it takes all kinds of people, and you have to really learn the skill of understanding enough about what everybody else's specialty discipline is to be able to make some really sometimes life affecting decisions, right? Because you are responsible for the success of the mission and the health and safety of the crew. And so that is, again, very humbling to do that, but also very exciting.
And we have one final question. This is my favorite one because there are so many possibilities in engineering, like you highlighted today. But what gives you hope for the future of space exploration?
I will tell you, it's people like you and folks on this call who are interested in what we're doing and are excited to take up the mantle and continue that charge. There's something uniquely, I think, human in our characteristic to want to explore, and space is that natural place to go explore and try out new things. And it brings people together. If I haven't said it enough yet, right, it's very unifying, and it brings together people of different backgrounds, people with different experiences, people from different nationalities, all coming together for a common purpose that is for good, and that is furthering humanity, not only in exploration, but also in the technologies that we can then use here on Earth.
That's an incredible way to wrap up our conversation. So thank you for that. And I
Thank
believe that's
you.
all the questions we have time for today. So thank you so much, Cathy, for joining us. I do have to say it was so inspirational for me, and I'm sure for all the students who are tuning in, and really a lot of gems in our conversation. But if there's one big takeaway for me, it's that curiosity and collaboration is so necessary in our world. And you talked about it in terms of space exploration, but we can all be explorers and scientists, like you said, by asking questions and being open to new things. So thank you for sharing all of that and kind of instilling that curiosity in all of us to go and explore.
Thank you, Kavya. It was great to be with you all today.
Thank you. All right, so now it's time to introduce our hands-on challenge.
Hello, my name is Iman Beck, and I'm an education specialist at NASA. Did you know that the International Space Station, where astronauts live and work, spans more than 350 feet end to end? That's about the length of a football field. The space station is supported by what is known as the Integrated Truss Structure. This truss structure supports solar panels and radiators that provide electrical power to the station and help keep it cool. Trusses are made up of triangle shapes for strength. Engineers also use a truss design here on Earth to build bridges and roofs. Today, I have an engineering design challenge for you. Design, build, and test a straw bridge with a truss design that spans more than 25 centimeters and holds as much weight as possible without collapsing. Here are the materials you can use. 20 straight, not flexible drinking straws, a small paper cup, some tape, scissors, 2 chairs placed 25 centimeters apart, a ruler or measuring tape, and pennies or other objects that hold weight. As you brainstorm designs, study truss designs seen in bridges. Sketch out some truss designs for your bridge that you think will make it very strong. When you're ready to build, place 2 chairs placed exactly 25 centimeters apart. Construct your straw and tape truss bridge so that it spans the distance between the chairs and the ends rest equally on both chairs. To test your design, place pennies in the paper cup and rest it on the middle of your bridge. Keep adding pennies. How many can your bridge hold before it breaks? If your bridge collapses right away, that's okay. Engineers pay extra attention to design flaws so they can redesign and eliminate them. Find the weak point in your truss design and try to strengthen that part so that your bridge can hold even more weight. Is your truss bridge really strong? Then challenge yourself further and build a second bridge with a connector, just like the integrated truss structure used on the International Space Station. Have fun!
So I hope that all of you will try the Truss Bridge Challenge and share your results with us. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. Before you leave today, please make sure to fill out the quick survey. And also be sure to tune in for our next episode of Chats with Changemakers. It's on Thursday, March 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And we will chat with their next guest, Francesca Ogundele, a chemical engineer at Shell. See you next time.